Alan Fisher recently made a really good video about highway median rail stations, where he makes fantastic points about why one wouldn't want a station like this. And so I'm familiar that in making this video, I'm going against what is a commonly held belief in the transit community, including one I myself have held historically. But I think the situation is complex. Transit along highways is less expensive, and costs are a real issue, perhaps the biggest issue for transit expansion in a lot of parts of the world. Highways are just one form of linear infrastructure, but you can get insights into some of the reservations that planners have about all kinds of forms of linear infrastructure, from hydro corridors to old rail right-of-ways for rapid transit. This, obviously, I hope, is a video that isn't about me proposing we build highway median metro lines all over the place. It's really more about why this is done all around the world, and why it's often not such a big deal. If you're new here, I'm Reece and this is RMTransit, a channel about public transit all around the world and how to better plan it. I made a video 2 years ago called Highways Can Be Useful, and the fundamental idea behind it was that while urban highways are a blight, that shouldn't prevent us from using those same corridors to provide better transit service, since they're already there. In the long term, if you're using a highway right-of-way for public transit, you can even start to talk about things like taking away lanes from cars. Of course, sometimes highways are in the middle of nowhere, and often in such cases there aren't a ton of people who can or will want to walk up. But that's not always the case, and a highway right-of-way can be a good way to get some trackage laid down pretty quickly and inexpensively. And to be clear, highway-aligned transit isn't just a North American phenomenon. It exists around the world, in too many contexts and too many cities to be completely written off. Chicago probably has the prototypical median metro, with various sections of the L running down the median of freeways. But while it might be prototypical, I wouldn't necessarily call it average. You also probably wouldn't plan to put a highway and a metro line in the same place if you were planning a city anew. You'd put the trains where the people are and the cars where they are not. It's really important to note that not all highways are equal. Examples like the Dan Ryan in Chicago with 6 or 7 or more lanes on both sides of the station are not comparable to smaller highway median stations in Asia and Europe and other places in North America where you might just have 2 lanes on both sides. The definition of highway in a lot of the world just isn't necessarily 10 lanes of traffic, and that also means it's a lot less loud. And it's worth pointing out that these same criticisms tend to be leveled against rapid transit that's aligned on the side of a highway corridor or in other linear infrastructure corridors, as opposed to, say, being built under or above a local street. For example, I've heard time and time again that a hydro corridor isn't a good place to build rapid transit. Immediately, people have to walk 100 meters to get out of the hydro corridor, you can't build high density, and it's away from the centers of activity. But land use and walkshed considerations, important as they are, shouldn't be our only considerations when planning new transit. Look at the Finch West LRT in Toronto, for example. The line is being built traveling west from Line 1 of the subway in the median of Finch Avenue West. But at least for the eastern part of the line, I think the Finch Hydro Corridor would have been a much better location for this transit. Now, when I've suggested this to people in Toronto, I've often heard that the activity is on Finch, not in the Hydro Corridor, and that if you built in the Hydro Corridor, people would have to walk to the Hydro Corridor to access the transit. And then, of course, also that if you build in a Hydro Corridor, a lot of your walkshed will be taken up by undevelopable Hydro Corridor land. But the reality is different on the ground. When you look at where the density actually is, it's concentrated closer to the hydro corridor than to Finch Avenue, probably because Finch Avenue is loud and the hydro corridor is not. And if you were to build the transit in the hydro corridor, residents on both sides, which includes people living in apartment blocks, would have easier access, instead of residents on one side of the hydro corridor having to walk the long distance across it and then some to get to transit, making one side the wrong side of the corridor. Better yet, since the hydro corridor is straight and has few roads crossing it, you could grade separate the transit here and run it quite quickly. And grade separation would mean faster speeds, higher reliability, and perhaps even more frequency. Effectively, by building in the hydro corridor, you get the best of all worlds. And even if density wasn't actually concentrated on that corridor, you still might be expanding your catchment by providing more frequent and faster service to people down the line. Essentially, sometimes by moving transit away from some people, you might actually make the transit more attractive on the whole, attracting more riders. Now, of course, not every rail alignment should be built according to this logic, but in lower density areas, it can make a lot of sense. At the end of the day, the lower density of suburban areas just makes it harder to justify higher spending on these portions of rapid transit. Highways can be a potential solution to this problem, and highways might also have other benefits, like letting you go faster. The gold standard for this is probably Perth in Western Australia. The backbone of the Trans-Perth system today are two modern highway-running rail lines that provide service so fast that it's actually faster than the cars in these same corridors. By using the highways to provide faster service to a large portion of the metro area, Perth has created a transit success story. And while I don't think every city should be emulating Perth, there are things we can learn. Those lower costs, for example, matter a lot. It's often not a choice between tunneling a line and building it in the middle of a highway. It's highway or nothing. That's especially true these days in North America and other places in the world where tunneling costs exceed $1 billion per mile. At the end of the day, if it's going to be highway rapid transit or no rapid transit, I would generally choose highway rapid transit. And that's especially true because running along a highway doesn't mean the entire route is on a highway. A highway could be a useful shortcut or go-between between different dense areas. And the best systems that use highway running also weave out of the highway to directly serve major transit-oriented developments as well as towns and city centers. And to be clear, better alternatives also do exist. I already mentioned hydro corridors, but then there are also old rail corridors, which are narrower, possibly already grade separated, and better mesh with development. Ultimately, while passenger experience and land use considerations are important, they sometimes need to be weighed against speed and reliability, which are not minor details. And I'd argue that metros running along highways or other linear infrastructure don't even necessarily have to have terrible land use and walkability. While some highway median stations are truly horrendously loud and uncomfortable, cities like Toronto and Montreal show that you can design stations that are fine, whether that be using the station structure or platform screen doors to protect passengers from the noise of cars. It shouldn't really be a surprise to us that if you simply build a platform in the middle of a highway with nothing around it, it's going to be a miserable experience. Glencairn Station in Toronto shows this really well. The streets that actually cross the highway and provide access to the station aren't really wide, they're just 2 lanes with an extra drop-off lane for passengers. And since the station has entrances on both sides of the street, you can access from either direction without needing to cross. At the same time, since the station isn't located near an interchange, the highway is narrower and people don't have to walk a great distance to access the station. There's even decent density and a street with lots of shops nearby, and I don't see a ton of surface parking. This is how a lot of median metro lines feel in cities from Mexico City to Paris. Ultimately, the walk shed also isn't the only shed. I mean, if you're doing things right, it shouldn't be. People should be able to bike and take transit to your station, and in a lot of suburban areas, that's actually going to be a bigger driver of ridership. It certainly is in places in Toronto. And in a lot of places, even places with decent development, you can get more riders from feeder bus routes than from the actual development. As OD Urbanity talked about in a recent video, just having decent cycling options to a station can massively expand its reach and reduce the relevance of a walkshed that might be 20% smaller. Of course, land use is always going to be challenging near highways. Alan isn't wrong. But the less major your highway, the more you can do. And with rapid transit, it's even easier to make the argument to remove or cap a highway, something which has definitely been proposed at Glencairn, and then you can go bananas with housing development. Most importantly, highways are actually a pretty good place for local transit connections, especially with buses where passengers can be dropped off right at the side of the road next to entrances that allow them to access the metro. You can even have more elaborate bus terminal type connections at major connection points. So ultimately, I think highway stations, or more accurately roadway stations, are often fine. Sure, you probably only want a couple in your system, but they're just another type of station. You have downtown stations, neighborhood stations, and highway median stations can serve a different role, probably serving longer distance commuters on buses, or perhaps intersecting with a major cycle route like a greenway. I'd much rather rebuild a highway-style station with a reasonable design in a low-density area if it means being able to spend more in denser places where the cost is justified and more places exist to connect. Ultimately, saving money building a highway station in a lower density area is a reasonable trade-off to make if it means spending more in denser places that justify rapid transit to a higher degree. So with that, thanks for watching.